Well, hey again, everybody. I'm glad that you were joining us again, and sorry about the delay last week. For those of y'all who caught it, we had some stuff happen, and I just could not get class for Wednesday night organized and recorded in time, especially while still being able to take care of stuff for Sunday. So that kind of got my attention, and this class got skipped. So thanks for hanging with me. We are continuing on in our study of Matthew's Gospel. We've made it up to chapter 9, as you can see right there. But yeah, I've been enjoying our work through of the text. Anytime there's been a bit of a break for longer than just week to week, I like to do a little bit of catch up. Just some background again to remind you of where we are and what's going on. Matthew writes, of course, as I've said now several times, to a predominantly Jewish audience who's facing a crisis inside its own community, where they are slowly realizing or being treated as if they don't belong in the synagogues, that there's not really a place for them there. And I think, just as an aside, that's something we sometimes miss as, Christians 2,000 years down the road. But early on, this was a Jewish movement, and it wasn't understood by its earliest Jewish followers as a separate thing from Judaism. It was a continuation of what God had always been doing, and therefore, of course, they still go to the synagogues to worship. Of course, they still participate in temple life, and we even see Jesus' disciples. Sorry, I'm drinking something hot to keep my throat going this morning. We even see Jesus' disciples go back to the temple, not just to talk with people about Christ, but also to worship. I mean, they're there on Pentecost for a reason. And it's just a continuation of what they've always done. By the time Matthew writes this gospel, it's becoming apparent that maybe that is not going to be the case. And so there's this question of whether or not we belong, and if we don't belong, which do we choose? And if we're going to choose, why should we choose Jesus? So Matthew spends a lot of time talking about why you should follow Jesus and what it looks like to follow Jesus, and how that is both a fulfillment and a shift from what they've always had. By the time we get to chapter 9, we're really seeing Matthew take the time to talk about Jesus's authority as a way to remind his readers that Jesus is in fact worth following. And that there is value and power in following, especially with the stories that we are going to look at today. So the first thing that I want to share with you, I've been doing quotes as we've gone week to week. And this week's was a little bit harder at first, and then I realized there's no reason I can't quote the Bible from a slightly different passage than what we've been looking at, and it really fits well. The first verse of Hebrews 11. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. That is a message, certainly, that Matthew's audience needs to hear, and it's a message that the verses that we're going to look at in chapter 9 tell. So, without further ado, as I lift my podium here up a little bit, high enough that I can read it, but low enough that you can't see it on camera, we'll go ahead and jump in with Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 18. As Jesus was saying this, the leader of the synagogue came and knelt before him. "My daughter has just died," he said, "but you can bring her to life again if you just come lay your hand on her." So Jesus and his disciples got up and went with him. Now a woman who had been suffering for 12 years with constant bleeding came up behind him. She touched the fringe of his robe, for she thought, "If I can just touch the robe, I will be healed." Jesus turned around when he saw her and said, "Daughter, be encouraged. Your faith has made you well." And the woman was healed at that moment. When Jesus arrived at the official's home, he saw the noisy crowd and heard the funeral music. "Get out," he told them. "The girl isn't dead. She's only asleep." But the crowd laughed at him. After the crowd was put outside, however, Jesus went in and took the girl by the hand, and she stood up. Reports of this miracle swept through the entire countryside. So, Jesus had just been talking with some disciples of John about fasting, and this synagogue leader interrupts their conversation. And so first, just a comment about the fact that it is a synagogue leader that comes and interrupts Jesus. What I would point out is that Matthew does not use the phrase synagogue leader. That's something that most translators add into Matthew, because in Mark's telling of this story, it signifies a synagogue leader. For Matthew's audience, this is just a leader of the community, and most translators have chosen to interpret that as a synagogue leader, which probably does a disservice to Matthew, because one of the things that Matthew is showing is that that followers of Jesus stand on their own 2 feet, that the synagogue is not central to that. And, here we have this person come up, but we still see this connection. What is interesting is that this leader of the community comes up to Jesus, and in Matthew's telling of the story, again, slightly different from Mark, he says, "My daughter has just died." So when Mark tells this story, the man's daughter is sick, and he wants Jesus to come quickly. There are just a number of differences between Matthew's telling and Mark's telling. And as I've said before, that's not terribly important. They're using an event that happened with the details as they know them, with some creative license in order to help make sure that the point, the message, is understood. Because again, for the authors, for the time that Jesus lived, for the time that these people wrote, detailed historical accuracy was not the point, and not something that most people were concerned about. It really was getting the point across. And the point, as Matthew wants us to understand, is that you can have confidence in Jesus. You get to bring certainty with you. And so here in this moment, this local leader who has crossed paths with Jesus in some form or another, whether it's by hearing him teach, or by witnessing some of his other miracles that have taken place, or simply by having heard about those stories without never seeing Jesus himself, this leader knows that Jesus can make a difference in this situation. This is not a long walk. They're not in Jerusalem going from one side of the town to the other. I think by this point, if I remember correctly, as Matthew tells it, they're back in Capernaum. It's not that far from one place to another. And yet, in the time period between starting the walk towards the man's house and getting there, they've already gotten funeral mourners, funeral music, like everything is already together for the funeral. In Jewish custom, you buried people on the day that they died. That was just how it worked. There was no 3-day wait. You didn't stash them in cold storage. That's just not what happened. So you moved very quickly from death to mourning to burial, and that was just the process. So this girl has passed. Her dad has come to Jesus. In the meantime, professional mourners have shown up, because that's what is supposed to happen. Everything that is happening is exactly what is supposed to happen. There's one thing that wasn't, and that is the dad going to find Jesus. That is the thing that is outside the norm in this scenario. Get back to the house. Jesus raises her from the dead, and it all starts because this man has enough confidence in who Jesus is, and specifically in Jesus's power and authority, that he is willing to step away from what he is supposed to do in order to find Jesus, because he knows what he can do. So again, the idea in that story is that we can have confidence, and trust. There is hope in the power and the authority of Jesus. And in the middle of that story, there is another one thrown in there, as if the raising of the girl from the dead was not enough. You have this woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. And she sees Jesus, people around him, and she doesn't want to interrupt him. She may have even overheard this conversation and has no desire to slow him down, because she too has some confidence. She has confidence in the power and authority of Jesus, so much so that she believes that all she has to do is reach out and touch his robe. And we could have a conversation about cultural belief in material magic and stuff like that, or how they understood these miracles to take place. And none of that is really important here, because what she thought was powerful, which is Jesus, she comes to find out is not the only source of power and authority. Because what happens is she touches his robe, and he turns around and then speaks to her and doesn't say, "Your touching of my robe made you well." Again, Matthew tells this story a little bit differently. For Mark, when this story is told, as soon as the robe is touched, Jesus feels power leave him. In this case, Jesus turns and looks at her and says, "Your faith has made you well." And it's at that moment, after Jesus declares the power of her faith, that she experiences healing. So in this first section that we're looking at tonight, I'm recording again in the middle of the day. It's so weird trying to keep straight all of those things. What we see is the power of faith. There is a man whose faith drives him to Jesus when everybody else is saying that all hope is gone. There's a woman who is driven to Jesus after experience has told her that all hope is gone. And both of them, because they are driven to Jesus, experience Jesus' power, Jesus' healing, and the wholeness, the restoration that Jesus can provide. Again, the way Matthew tells these two stories, the emphasis is on the power that faith in Christ provides us. So it's not about which synagogue you're in. It's not about staying connected in all of the traditional ways. It's about recognizing that in Jesus there is something available to us, to you and me, and being driven by that. And these two people, this man and this woman, embody that fully. Continuing on, if I can get the page to turn, there we go. Continuing on, in verse 27, after Jesus left the girl's home, two blind men followed along behind him, shouting, "Son of David, have mercy on us." They went right into the house where he was staying. And Jesus asked them, "Do you believe that I can make you see?" Which, I mean, the answer to that question at this point is kind of obvious. Hold on. They've just followed him into somebody else's home, which granted would have been less unusual, far less unusual in Jesus' day than it is in our own. But still, that says something about their dogged dedication to their belief that Jesus can do something about it. Because they continue to pursue Jesus, even though Jesus obviously is walking away from them while they're shouting, "Son of David, have mercy, Son of David, have mercy." He gets there, he turns around, and these two people are in the house that he's in. He asks this question, "Do you believe?" One worded very intentionally by Matthew, and they said, "Yes, Lord, we believe." Then he touched their eyes and said, "Because of your faith, it will happen." Then their eyes were opened and they could see. Jesus sternly warned them, "Don't tell anybody about this," but instead they went out and spread his fame all over the region. So here again, we have another story interwoven with the first two, where these two people, driven by a belief of faith that Jesus can do something about their situation, are willing to follow Jesus wherever he goes in order to get the opportunity to have him heal them. That's how much they believe in Jesus' power and in Jesus' authority. There is a confidence that Jesus can change their life. They just get to him. And so they follow him. I love that Jesus just keeps walking away from them. And that feels odd, because I think what we want to have happen is for these people to call out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus goes, "Okay, mercy is granted," and they're healed. And everybody goes, "Yay!" And Jesus says, "Tell everybody." But that's not the case. Instead, they have to keep it up. They have to keep pursuing. They have to keep hoping, and they do. And so Matthew shares again with his audience the story where two people driven by faith are willing to seek Jesus out, to continue to follow, even though their circumstances don't change the first time they cry out. They believe and they pursue and they're healed. And then there's this fourth story. When they left, a demon-possessed man who couldn't speak was brought to Jesus. So Jesus cast out the demon, and then the man began to speak. The crowds were amazed. "Nothing like this has ever happened in all of Israel," they exclaimed. But the Pharisees said, "He can cast out demons because he's empowered by the prince of demons." And that's really where this conversation and all of these stories are meant to lead us. This question about where Jesus' authority and Jesus' power comes from. That's the intent of these stories. There's a reason that that's the statement from the Pharisees that Matthew includes at the end of all of this. It's by the power of demons that he casts out demons, and that's it. There's your answer. There's where the source of his authority is. But each and every story that we've looked at along the way shows that Jesus is empowered by something else. And so in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, you see that Jesus is shaped by God through the laws it's been passed down, and especially its intent. So Jesus talks about law and what it looks like to live it out fully. If you read early in Matthew, you see the guiding hand of God in Jesus' birth and Jesus' family and Jesus' early days as he's rescued from Herod and spends time in Egypt and come back. If you know the story, you know the source of his authority. But the Pharisees don't know the story. Nor do they care to know the story. They're far more interested in showing his evilness, maintaining their power and authority, because there's always this tension between who gets it, this assumption that there is not enough to go around, or that we should be the ones that have it. The Pharisees buy into that idea to their own detriment. And so you see this gap between the people who believe, whether that's the man with the daughter, or the woman with the bleeding, or the men who are blind, or the person who with the demon, and the people who bring him to Jesus. All of these people in faith come to Jesus. And the Pharisees don't ever come to Jesus in faith as a group. Instead, what you have is people watching from the side, making judgments, issuing statements, but never investing in the ministry of Jesus as it was. And so they are unable to see, they're unable to get it because they're not pursuing Jesus, they're pursuing their own ends, their own power, their own authority. And in that way, Matthew reminds us that what we are after, what we pursue, matters. It shapes what we're looking for and what we are willing to see. And so they see these miracles and they recognize that they're powerful, but they give the credit of that power to someone other than God because they can't bring themselves to make that declaration. I think the question for us is, do we have the type of confidence that drives us to Jesus? Like, what you see in these stories is that, a type of faith, a type of belief that is so certain that even in the most extreme moments, even at the end of a lifetime of suffering, in spite of all of the experience that they have that says the dead cannot be raised, the bleeding will not stop, sight will not be restored, the demon will have control forever. In spite of all of that, people come to Jesus because they believe that he is powerful enough, that his authority from God gives him the ability to change their circumstances for the better. And so I think that is an important question for us. The alternative for us is very often what I think the Pharisees are chasing after. They rely on their own understanding, their own influence, their own power, their own ability to make things the way they want them to be. I think if we read these stories and don't recognize our inclination to make the same choices, to do the same things that the Pharisees do, then we're missing a valuable teaching. Interestingly enough, this is actually going to connect to what we look at for our sermon on Sunday. The question of whether or not we trust God's authority, ability, and pathway, or we're doggedly certain in our own. Because depending on how you answer that question, you'll pursue different things. And so in this story, we have people who pursue Jesus, and we have people who don't. And so for Matthew's audience, they're essentially given a couple of options. You can pursue Jesus with confidence that Jesus can and will make things better, that Jesus' authority is in fact from God, that Jesus' power and work was divine, or you can reject that and do what the Pharisees did and stand on the sidelines. But one of those has divine power, and one of those is incredibly human, and you've got to decide which you're going to pursue. I think that's a good stopping point for this evening. We will pick up with the tail end of chapter 9 and the beginning of chapter 10 next week, barring any other hospital trips. Fingers crossed that doesn't happen. So, if you want to, again, go ahead and read ahead. Please do so. If you have not done so already, I strongly encourage you to sit down and read the book of Matthew from beginning to end. These are written not so that we go back and dissect verses out of it, but so that we can understand the message and heart of God as seen in Jesus. And that's meant to be read in a setting. It would have been originally heard in one setting. And so I think we need to do some more work in taking these texts in the way they were intended. Matthew uses repetition and keywords so that you get it over and over and over again. And if all you do with Matthew is look at 10 to 20 verses every week, then you're missing some of that because I can't remind you often enough. So take the time, sit down, read it beginning to end. All right, that does it for us this evening. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.